Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever it is, wherever you are, welcome to the Good Values Podcast. Now, in this episode, I speak to someone who I've been following on Instagram for quite a while. I'm a huge fan of his work. I love 2000 AD as a publication, and he is one of the illustrators. He's got a great personality, really great sense of humour. I know you're going to love him. This is the first part of a 3-part episode because that's how good the conversation was. So this is the first part of my conversation with Tom Foster. Okay, so would you mind introducing yourself for the audience, please?
Okay, hello, I'm Tom Foster. I draw comics mostly for 2000 AD and Judge Dredd magazine. And I do occasional bits and pieces elsewhere, but that's kind of what I'm known for.
How long have you been working for 2000 AD?
I guess it'll be, in a year's time, it'll be 10 years. So I guess 9 years. Yeah. I keep thinking it's coming up on the decade. And it always seems to be, it's another year away. But it definitely feels like a big chunk of my life that I've spent doing this now. I can't really remember what it feels like to have a different job.
That's fantastic.
It's just my life now.
Yeah.
And I used to feel like sort of a pretty kind of lazy, feckless person who didn't do very much work. And now I feel overworked most of the time, which is much better for the most part.
I've heard that the page rate for professional cartoonists, are you happy with the term cartoonist?
Yeah, go ahead, yeah.
I've heard that the page rate is quite intense, and I've had advice from someone who was a Doctor Who comic book artist saying don't get into drawing comic books because it takes over your life and all this. And I think he was saying because it was a page a day at least of drawing and inking, I think he was doing, he said it just became too intense. Has your experience been that it's quite an intense workload?
It is intense, yes, and it does take over your life. Because it is such an investment in time to make something that will be digested quite quickly. If I'm doing a chapter of Dredd that's going to be in the prog, that's only 6 pages or so. So people can read that in about 10 minutes.
Yeah.
And it takes me the better part of, takes me about a day to a day and a half to ink a page, and about somewhere in between a day and a half and 2 days to pencil a page. So I work considerably slower than the sort of what was considered the industry standard, although I feel like there is no real industry standard. Everybody, from big name comic book artists right down to smaller scale indie press stuff, everybody has kind of a different rate of working with. A page a day is sort of that's what most comic book editors, I think, would like you to be able to produce ideally, and particularly for US comics because they're 22 pages a month. If you're penciling a page a day, then you're penciling, an issue a month. So that works out quite well. But really, it's only a kind of a notional figure. People like Lee Weeks maybe only produce 2 or 3 full comics a year, and they'll maybe do some cover work or whatever. Whereas somebody like P.J Holden for 2000 AD, he can produce several fully inked pages in a day. So, it's a very, very broad spectrum. I'm just glad to be on it somewhere.
Yeah. Well, I was watching the lockdown podcast from the 2000 AD YouTube channel, and you mentioned on there how part of your page rate was inspired by Brian Bolland, who's one of my favorite artists from 2000 AD, probably my favorite. So what was his page? Because I wasn't aware of what his page rate was when you were mentioning how you would aspiring to try and get a quality and quantity.
Well, I mean, yeah, part of that came about, I think, because Mike Mulcher, who was chairing the debate, was sort of was poking fun at me a little bit, and quite justifiably, because my work, the style of my work, the look of my work is very influenced by Brian Bolland. And he was suggesting that maybe I had taken that a little bit too far into actually being as slow as Brian Bolland was. And my point was, I guess, that well, if you're going to try and produce work of a similar standard, then to try and do it quicker than he did it would be, it's already pretty arrogant to think you can come anywhere close to the quality, but to think you can knock it out in a day or whatever, it's just not realistic. So it does take a lot longer to manufacture that stuff, because it's a matter of attention to detail and trying to get as many areas of things right and kind of polished and tight line work and everything as possible. And that is very time consuming, and there's no cutting corners really. You've just got to kind of sit down and draw everything on the page as well as you can. And that's part, I guess, of why it can be I think regardless of what your work rate is for as a comic book artist, pretty much everybody who's earning a living in comics is absolutely knocking their pan in to get the work done as quickly as they can to the highest standard that they can. And so even though I'm a lot slower, I'm spending as many hours a day working as somebody who's quicker. It's just taking longer to get the individual pages finished. There are times where I can take it a bit slower, if I've not got much on or whatever. I can have breaks during the day and stuff and be a little bit less intense with my workload. But at the moment, when I'm working on multi-part stories in particular, there's every part that you're a little bit late with gives you less time on the next one. And so for something like this that's 8 parts long, if I'm late handing in part 3, then it just snowballs, but it's at the moment, it's I'm ahead of the script at the moment. I'm finishing my artwork before the next script is ready. So I as far as I'm concerned, if I'm doing that much, then I'm okay. I'm not letting anybody down, because I couldn't be any further ahead logistically.
Well, I can imagine for a multi-part story. See, for me, I can imagine it's a kind of consistency nightmare where I'd have this serial killer looking, string with pins going from post-it notes to photograph to go okay, this judge has this scuff mark on this, on his knee pad here, and then this happened there, and this has got to be carried through just in case there's a return to, is there any continuity?
Continuity stuff can it doesn't eat up time very much, because you can always refer back to your previous pages. Everything I make for the magazine has to get scanned in, or for the 2000 AD has to get scanned in and live on the computer at some point, even though I do it as much as possible with traditional materials. So if I can't remember what a particular character looks like or what they were like when we last saw them, I can just bring it up pretty easily.
Because it was so humorous, your video, the from the drawing board video, I didn't know how much was real and how much wasn't when you were showing the 3D renderings, I thought, is that how you're doing it? Do you not have reference that you grab from different sources? Do you actually create these 3D renders to have these different anatomical accuracies?
At the time, that was how I was doing it. I was building the scenes in 3D from largely prefabricated models. Like I wasn't like building the characters in ZBrush or anything. I was using posing software called DAZ 3D, which, you know, comes with a number of assets by default, including figures. And you can purchase or construct your own assets to go in there as well.
Yeah. And
they've got all the kind of lighting and camera tools and stuff. And I still use it occasionally to try and work out like maybe some complicated foreshortening or unusual lighting or something that that I can't find photo reference for easily, or I'll combine it with photo reference. But I never trace the models anymore, and I don't really use DAZ 3D for that much now. I mostly use either photo reference or just try and get it down from scratch. But my process has more or less completely changed since I made the video. The only similarity being really that the inking's all done traditionally by hand. The inking hasn't really changed. I've changed, brushes and the ink that I use and the pens that I use, but the actual process is the same as it ever was. And I do still have that kind of second stage of penciling where I tighten everything up, but it's really more, there's a lot more drawing goes on at that stage now than there was at that time. And using the 3D models was just as time consuming as doing things practically, which you wouldn't think it would be. You'd think it would take longer to draw stuff from scratch than to start with a 3D model and then go in and trace the kind of key elements of it and just put the details in yourself. But the amount of time it takes to actually pose the models and light the models and stuff, you're posing every finger sometimes on the model and trying to light the scene properly and stuff. And you'd be just as quick drawing a rough version of it and using that as the basis. And that works better for the finished page as well. When you use 3D models to when you're too reliant on 3D models, it can really show in the finished artwork. It doesn't look like it's been drawn with, it doesn't look like it's been drawn two-dimensionally. And when you draw two-dimensionally, there are decisions that you make that make things work in a two-dimensional world. And kind of compensate for the fact that it is two-dimensional. Whereas when you're starting with a computer model that is at least a very, very accurate representation of a three-dimensional thing, it's very difficult to compose your shots in the same way and make the same micro adjustments that can really fill out a composition. And it's stuff you just don't even think of. You do it like subconsciously when you're drawing, just fitting everything in the right place and choosing a sort of sense of perspective that works for that image alone, and not because, technically there are a kind of infinite number of vanishing points out there. Like it's a bit difficult to explain, like, because it's born out of just the experience of doing it over and over again.
I mean, I have a prop here. I was wondering whether it'd be okay for you to sort of see. This is from Blockmania. This is because it's by Bolland, and I have the old 2000 AD.
Oh, nice.
And this is just a lovely sequence where this kind of...
I know it well.
Yeah, absolutely beautiful. It's some of my favorite illustration ever, I think. So, and I can imagine with 3D models, to have certain things elongated for motion and for kind of strength and impact would be lost in the process.
Yes.
Yeah.
You're onto something there. It's definitely as much about emphasis as it is about like composition. When you're drawing, you do make those decisions about, well, what's important in this image? What am I trying to get across? And every decision you make, from the anatomical decisions to the kind of blocking decisions, all of that stuff, and even the rendering decisions to some extent, it is all decision making. You choose one thing over something else. So doing as much of the process just kind of organically drawing as possible gives you that level of total autonomy in terms of the way that the characters look, the way that they emote, and just the way that they're kind of physically exist on the page. So yeah, you're right. A page like that is a good example. Action scenes and things where motion and kind of fluidity and or even just like humanity are are what's kind of being showcased. Using a prefabricated 3D model often won't get you the effect that you want, because it is quite stiff and static and often not actually that anatomically correct either. When you're posing it, it looks good in sort of certain poses and from certain angles, but usually the muscles won't actually function like human muscles. At the end of the day, it's just basically just a very simple skeleton with a kind of rubber homunculus around it. That bends. But and there will be some morphs in it to try and compensate for that, but for the most part, like you're better off with real world reference or your own understanding of anatomy if you've studied it for long enough.
Have you ever been tempted to make a Bisley-esque monstrosity, where the muscles are just impossible and you can hide phallic shapes and all sorts that he used to do inside them? I mean, he was kind of infamous for political messaging, wasn't he? And all sorts of
I hadn't considered it until now. It sounds like fun. And it's the kind of thing that, you'd probably get the chance to do in 2000 AD at some point. Well, okay, there you go.
That'd be a fun.
Right. The 2000 AD writers, if anybody wants to write me a story where there's some kind of horrible Bernie Wrightson hooky style monster, then I'll happily take a crack at it. It's not something I've had to do yet, though. Oh, well, I suppose the nearest I got was there was a giant snail that I had to do in a Dread one shot.
Really?
But that was pretty closely based on just a snail. Like there wasn't like too much unusual anatomy. It had little kind of tendril suckery things coming out of its foot, face, whatever the front bit on the underside of a snail is. And that was a bit odd, but for the most part, like I didn't get to I haven't done much like fantasy beasts. I could get into that. That would be fun. I do kind of like the idea of trying to get them, particularly when I'm painting. If I'm doing painted covers for stuff, I do tend to lean more into trying to combine the kind of Bolland and Fabry styles into something that kind of works for me. So the idea of having stuff that's very kind of tight line work and kind of everything very proportionally sound, along with that sort of inventiveness of anatomy it's an idea that it would be really nice to get the opportunity to explore, but again, I can imagine it presents some significant challenges.
I appreciate that. Is it something which you've done? Have you done much life drawing in order to get to where you are for an understanding of form and kind of, anatomy?
Yeah, well, I mean, I went to art college and we had life drawing there. Quite a lot in the first year of art college, and then sort of, I think once a week we had it when I was studying illustration specifically. But then I think the year after I left, they got rid of life drawing from the illustration course at the art college that I went to, which I don't think will necessarily have, it certainly wasn't popular with students that they got rid of it. But I took up life drawing classes again last year, or year before last, and then for quite a while into last year, just to kind of sit alongside the other things that I was using as the foundations for drawing, because it had been a long time since I'd been at art college. It'd been a long time since I'd done a life drawing. I don't really draw much from observation without the sort of structure of a life drawing class. The only drawing I do from observation really is when I'm using photo reference, or using my own hand as a model for a hand in a comic book page or something. And it's good practice to keep your observational skills strong, as well as your understanding of anatomy as a kind of academic subject. And like a few years ago, about a year or two after I made the switch from using 3D models as the groundwork for drawing, I decided that I kind of needed to give myself a better education in anatomy and anatomical drawing, because what I actually had was quite patchy, and a lot of the, we had done observational life drawings at university, but we hadn't really studied anatomy in any degree of kind of scientific detail. So I decided to make a point of finally reading an instructional art book from cover to cover. Up until a few years ago, the only actual kind of teaching you how to draw a book that I could confidently say that I'd actually read all the way through was How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way. And it's light on text, but I decided that I would read this, which is the Gottfried Baum's Complete Guide to Anatomy for Artists and Illustrators. It's a good 500 pages long, and it is dense. And if you can get past the first 80 or so pages of it, which are very kind of dry and academic, and get into the meat of the book, it's very, very good. And it is a very comprehensive guide to anatomy for artists. It's pretty much like a kind of university education worth of, or at least a sort of foundation course in anatomy. And that changed the game a bit for me. Like I was, the kind of connective tissue in my understanding of anatomy was sort of welded together a bit, or sutured together. And I could finally kind of, in quite a superficial way, but I finally had a pretty complete picture of how the body ought to look, and what bits go where, what muscles connect with what other ones, and most importantly the skeleton, which is notably an absent area of study for a lot of anatomy books. It's great. It's but like, just to give you a sense of what you have to get through to get to the good stuff, here is the opening passage from chapter 1. Here we go. The friendship of science and art. The late 19th century, with its revolutions in artistic thought, attributed every aspect of artistic creativity to an autonomous, self-sufficient artist subject, thus replacing the dialogue between the artist, the depicted object, and the art's beholders with a one-sided, subjective, self-exhibiting monologue. This drastic spiritual change meant that the whole vast field of appearances was now distrusted and questionable. Half measures, combined with a dualistic concept of artistic creation, have promulgated a concept of modernism that requires artists to know and wish to know and understand as little as possible about objects and human beings. This attitude is summed up by Gustav Brist's comments about physical science becoming a destroyer of the unified visual experience. To think in such a dualistic way is to lose sight of a real visual understanding of phenomena, to cause them to lose their identity with their core forces. Inevitably, this leads to a leveling in how we experience objects. As a result, even the depiction of the human being in art becomes questionable, insignificant, and indifferent, as this is only natural if the subject areas and resources that were once the allies of artistic education are to help artists to interpret the appearance of the human being in their own scientific way. So that's a sense of what you're dealing with. And it's quite like labored at times. But then after a while, it just gets into the business of telling you, what bits of the body are.
I'm fascinated in the subject, and even I was starting to glaze over, going, my goodness.
I suppose I was reading it in a particularly
no, you've
generous,
fantastic reading voice. No.
But yeah, it's tough going, and a lot of anatomy books or art books are actually are written quite poorly from the standpoint of being either accessible or interesting, even to somebody who is fundamentally interested.
Yeah.
If you're losing an audience who are already with you, then that's that's on you.
Yeah.
And to be fair, a lot of them do start with a kind of brief synopsis of why they think this particular book ought to exist. And I understand that they feel the need to pitch the book to the reader and the publisher.
Yeah.
But often they get sort of bogged down in their own sense of what the purpose of the book is supposed to be, and forget that for the most part the reason people bought it is because they wanted to know how to draw and to learn how to draw the things that they want to draw.
Yeah.
And the best art books always kind of keep that in the forefront of their minds, and the worst ones get far too into just kind of the way that you should think when you're drawing, which I think is probably the one thing which everybody is individually going to make their own decisions about.
Yeah.
I think there are mindsets which are conducive to better working habits, maybe, but beyond a few sort of efficiency tips and saying to people, you should actually kind of take this seriously and learn to draw stuff, quite take an academic approach at least for a while and see if it helps. There's very little I think you can tell people about what it is they ought to be striving for. It's kind of a zero-sum game doing that.
Yeah,
because you want them to have their own individual ideas about what they're striving for. That's why they're useful to the art world.
Yeah. One of the things I did want to ask you is that how much free rein do you have on composing environments and constructing architectural design for some of the stories that you're being given?
Well, with Megacity 1, you have a lot of license kind of.
I see.
Oh yeah, whatever you consider to be futuristic architecture, you can kind of there's little cues there from other artists and stuff, and you can certainly it's very useful to use the groundwork that's been laid down by previous Judge Dredd artists to to kind of get to an idea in your head of what the city is going to look like quite quickly, rather than trying to, build your own idea of it from scratch. But you can invent architecture to your heart's content, really. Like, I think everybody who's read Dread has an instinctive idea of what Megacity 1 is and consists of and looks like. And you're pretty much allowed. I have put it this way: I have never been given an editorial note saying, that building doesn't look quite right, or that doesn't look like it would be in Megacity 1. That's never happened. And I've had some less successful attempts at interpreting Megacity 1. Architecture was never my strong point, certainly inventing architecture. And interiors as well. Like, basically backgrounds I kind of struggled with, because I was putting so much attention into trying to get the figures and faces and things right, that I kind of thought, well, it's an economy of effort, isn't it? I can, if I spend less time worrying about the backgrounds and make them just sort of basically geometric and a bit kind of impressionistic, then I can, on the one hand, it will allow me extra time to work on the stuff that I'm more interested in, but also it will, from a kind of design point of view, you don't want to have too many areas of detail competing with one another, or too much design on the page, because then, the things you want to emphasize and focus on get sidelined, or at least suppressed. But I allowed that instinct to kind of overrun how I worked, to the point where I wasn't really thinking about environmental design anywhere near enough. And to the point where I wasn't even thinking about, my pages were starting to look very kind of, well, there was something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It wasn't that they looked empty, but they just didn't look quite populated enough.
Was it a balance?
Yeah, the balance was off, exactly. And so with this particular chapter, I just finished chapter 2 of the Dread story I'm currently working on. And with chapter 1, the thing that I really realized that I needed to work on was a kind of having a good sense of drama in the storytelling. Like, the way I made a decision from page 1 on the first Kyle Asher Judge Dredd story, that I wasn't going to break panel borders, and I wasn't going to have bleed panels or anything. And it was partly because I wanted the storytelling to be very kind of consistent, and focused, and sort of not visually distracting. But it was partly a time-saving technique as well, because bleed panels mean extra drawing. Broken panel borders, to a certain extent, mean extra drawing. So I thought, well, if I confine myself within very rigid panel borders for the whole thing, because I knew I was going to have to work a bit faster than usual, then maybe that'll save me a little bit of time. And it did. But I realized when I got onto this first chapter of the third Kyle Asher story that while the keeping a sort of fairly rigid sense of storytelling is quite good for the story, but you need to be able to compensate for that a little bit by making what's actually in the panels that little bit more dramatic. You really have to think about camera angles and foreshortening and presenting the information in a kind of entertaining way, particularly in action scenes, where everything I drew was kind of shot in quite a what's the word? There's a really good quotidian, quite a quotidian.
What's that term
It
mean?
just sort of means like every day and sort
Oh, I
of
see.
banal.
Yeah.
It wasn't exciting, you know.
Yeah.
It could be nicely drawn. Some of it was pretty,
Yeah.
but there wasn't a lot of like
Experimentation
tension
in
or energy in the
yeah,
panels.
yeah.
So I sort of switched that up a little bit with chapter 1, and I think that worked okay. But then every time you fix one problem, it just shines a brighter spotlight on something else that's wrong.
Yeah.
And in this case, it was the fact that, like I say, the balance was off. So with chapter 2, I made a decision right from the layout stage to have as many drawings in a panel as possible, as many environmental aspects, be something that had an interesting shape and had to actually kind of be worked out as possible, so that the page was just full of drawing rather than being selected areas of drawing with just a big black square room behind them or whatever. And it made like as near to an overnight difference as you can get. It was when I look at the artwork for the chapter I just finished, there's a huge boost to just how populated and complete the pages feel. And your eye doesn't focus in on any one detail. Like, to me, a comic book page, it can be very visually arresting if there's something on the page that immediately draws your attention. But ideally, for readability, that you shouldn't really be, one thing on the page, unless it's in the very first panel, shouldn't really be jumping out at the reader to the exclusion of the other elements. There should be, you don't want the kind of wallpaper effect where everything looks flat and murky and difficult to distinguish. But you also don't, you need there to be a moment where the reader has to make a conscious decision to engage with the story or not, not just engage with the visuals. And that's the pages I did for the last chapter look, I think, like story pages rather than, here's some nice artwork. And that's what I've been aiming for, from day one, was to try and make pages that told the story as well as possible and were absorbing for a reader, not just somebody who's a fan of a particular art style or whatever.
Yeah. Okay, so that is part 1 of my conversation with Tom Foster. Now, I loved the things that we discussed there. I loved showing you the artwork. It was just such a nice selection of images, and I thought he was really fun and interesting to talk to. There's 2 other great parts where he tells me more about his process and his personality a bit, which really helps to kind of get a rounded perspective on who he is as an artist and a person. I hope you enjoyed it. Please support his social media links that I'll be leaving in the description below, and support this channel by leaving a like, comment down below, subscribe to the channel, ring the notification bell, share this with friends and family. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next episode.